Hi, my name's Ed Poole, and I'm a Unison member. I am today talking to Paul Holmes, who's a potential candidate for Unison General Secretary. Hi, Paul.
Good evening, nice to see you.
And you, thanks for joining us. Um, could you tell us a bit about yourself, who you are, and why you're running?
Yeah, I've been a member of this union for over 40 years now. I've been a branch secretary of a union called Kirklees, which covers the Dewsbury, Batley and Huddersfield areas of West Yorkshire. For 30 years, I've been on the NEC for 13 years, and I've run the old NEC of Nalgo 35 years ago. I am standing because I think we're living in a time of change now, and I think it's really important, this election, for the direction that the union is going to go in.
Brilliant. What do you think Unison's place is in wider society, but also in the labour movement?
Unison's massive for several reasons, really. It's the biggest union in Britain. It's got 1.3 million members, but it's also in basically the most crucial union in the public sector of this country, in the hospitals, in the local government, in the police, etc., etc. So all the areas where people expect good services from local government and central government, the health service, etc., etc., Unison's at the forefront of that. Its members are being expected to deliver the services that the government are promising to people.
Okay, how do you see the relationship between Unison and the Labour Party? Obviously, I'm an ex-Labour Party member, and I started doing these videos as part of kind of a series of finding out what to do next, what activists who aren't happy with the Labour Party, what they could get involved in, still make a contribution. So there's a few different areas that obviously Unison has a big part to play in the Labour Party. So I can ask you about a few different areas. So how do you feel about the union's funding of the Labour Party?
Well, I don't see the Unison as funding the Labour Party. What I see the union as doing, because the Labour Party was set up by the trade unions, I see the Unison as saying to its representatives within Unison, go out into the Labour Party, fight for these policies and fight for these issues, social policies, etc., etc., in the Labour Party. If it were a question of funding, just funding, then I wouldn't be that keen on it. I think the relationship is very, very organic. And the job of the Labour link within Unison is for the thousands of people in Unison who pay to the Labour link for their money to be spent campaigning to defend their jobs and their conditions and public services in this country. And this sort of vision that somehow the money goes to the Labour Party so the Labour Party can run, I don't adhere to that whatsoever. I think that money goes for us to democratically get involved in the Labour
Okay.
Party.
And Unison sends delegates to the NEC, is that right? How many delegates do you get?
To the NEC of the Labour Party?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have 2 seats on the Labour Party NEC.
And I think they're a bit of a bugbear of mine, but they're elected by delegates at Unison Conference, is that right?
No. The structure for the Labour Party representation within Unison is separate from the National Delegate Conference. They have a section in the union called the Labour Link, and that Labour Link is run by 12 people from the NEC, who were appointed by the NEC, and 12 people were elected by the region. So that 24 people determine the policy. There is a separate Labour Link conference, but to all intents and purposes, the Labour Link part of the union is run separately.
Okay. And the recent leaked Labour report, obviously there were connections to Unison in that. What did you make of all of that?
Well, unlike a lot of people, I've read the report from beginning to end, and I think 3 things about it. One is that the undermining of the leadership of that I have expected that. What I didn't expect, I suppose, was that the seniority of those people that were undermining the situation. And then the final thing, which came as a complete and utter shock, that language on sexism and racism and insulting people that I thought had disappeared from the movement and society 30 or 40 years ago, being used by people who very highly paid people, supposed to be representing the movement. And for me, one of the lessons I learned from that, apart from we need to dig out and root out racism at all levels of the union, but what I found absolutely interesting was And I think it's a problem that's arisen in local government. I think it's arisen in unions, and it looks to have arisen in the structure of the Labour Party, is there's too close a relationship between those who are elected by the rank and file of the union, etc., and those who are employed. I think the two specific jobs. And what seems to have come out of that report is some people see, if you want to stand for election to be an MP or a councillor or a mayor, then stand for election. But if you want to be an employee of a labour movement organisation, then you should follow the direction of those people who are elected. And it's fairly clear in that report. The sexism and racism is horrific, but it's also clear in that report that some people say it's a restricted report, but it's really clear from that report that some people see themselves as active in wings of the party who are employees, and employees are a completely different thing. I've worked in local government now for over 40 years, and no chief officer in local government would say anything as derogatory about that in any arena about a councillor, because they know the two different roles.
Okay. One of the things that has been a bit controversial in Unison was the nomination of Keir Starmer during the Labour leadership election. What's your views on nominating Labour leadership candidates?
I always think the same thing. You need to separate two issues, because working class people, whatever organisation they're in, whether it's the allotment society, whether it's a football team, it's a working person's club, etc., etc. If you go to a meeting and say, "Oh, I'm representing this body," or "I'm the chair of this body," the first question you get from the body of the people at the meeting is, "Who elected you?" And our members fit in that category. The vast majority of our members are working class. The vast majority of our members are female, and the vast majority of our members are part-time. And the only question I think we need to answer in the union is, who did we nominate and why? And that's unclear to lots of our members. If you say to a member of the union on any issue, whether it's a strike ballot, whether it's about nominating somebody, whatever we say in the public arena, you've got to be able to say to those people, and this is the democratic process that we went through in the union, you always return to Tony Benn's point, really, which is, if you've got some power, who elected you into that position to get that power, and who can remove you? And I think the frustration of our members, if we nominate Keir Starmer, that's just a decision. That's the decision of the union. And most people will stand by that decision, provided that they understand the process that took place for that nomination. And that was completely not explained to our members. So you get this, it's on the television, it's in the newspapers, that Unison nominated Keir Starmer. And how did it happen? And that is the problem. The people who are paying the bill have to take part in the process.
Great. And I think another issue that some people see, perhaps a division between, say, membership of the Labour Party and trade unions, is on open selections and selection of candidates for prospective parliamentary candidates.
Yeah.
What's your view on that?
I will have a very clear view, and I return you to the allotment society and the bowling club, really. My view is really clear that every union official in Unison, whether they're a branch secretary or a steward, according to the rules of the union, has to put themselves up for re-election every year. I've had to do that 30 times as the branch secretary of a branch with over 8,000 members. And everybody in the union understands that process. Why anybody thinks that MPs are any different to that, I think we've got to get away from that. We've got to get away from this 19th century vision that somehow you decide to come down from Oxford or Cambridge. You choose the career as an MP. And that I heard MPs saying after the last general election, my career's in ruins, or this person, blah, blah, blah. It's not a career. You know, I get elected branch secretary of Kirklees Unison every year, and some years somebody stands against me. And if I don't get elected, then I'm not elected. That's the very nature of democracy. If you want a career, you have to get a job. This is an electoral process. And it were absolutely clear the last time I went to Labour Party conference, I think it was 2018, that the constituency Labour parties would make up 50% of the vote. I think they voted 93, 94% in favour of mandatory selection. The unions didn't. And I think the unions were wrong. I think there's no way really that anybody can be accountable for anything if they're not re-elected on some regular basis. I mean, I'm a big supporter of the Chartists. There's a big Chartist monument in Wakefield. And one of, I think, the 6 demands of the Chartist, the only one that's never been fulfilled is annual parliaments. And that sort of, the vision at the moment that somehow Parliament, you get a job for life, you could be there for 50 years, that you're being disloyal if you try and select somebody else, whatever that person does, and that Parliament doesn't sit for something like half the year. That's a democratic process. It's not. It's going back to a career system that I don't agree with. You know, any union general secretary, or branch secretary or shop steward would expect to be answerable on a regular basis, and I see absolutely nothing wrong with it. Completely, you know, every Labour councillor has to get selected each time they're up for election, and I've given 110% support to that.
Brilliant. And so I just wanted to get an idea of some of your personal views on various different issues as well. Just give people an idea of where you're coming from, I guess, on broader issues. So what's your views on the EU and membership of the EU?
Well, I think 2 things about the EU. One is I think it was a complete diversion, the referendum on the EU. It wasn't the problems facing this country at all. It was a made-up debate by the Tory party, because they had a massive split in the Tory party, and it's absolutely clear that Cameron's view was, we can have this referendum, we'll win it, and then that issue will go away. Unfortunately, they touched a running sore among people. If you study the results, which I have done, the referendum results, they're really interesting. And that's been reflected really in the issue isn't about the EU referendum. If you study the general election results from 2019, the 54 seats that Labour lost in England and Wales, 52 voted leave. And yet, I studied the Big Ten cities in Britain. Labour only lost 2 seats in the Big Ten cities in England, only 2 seats. All the losses were in the areas that feel forgotten and left out, that adjoin the big cities. You know, the big Leave votes were surrounding Manchester, surrounding Leeds, in the working class areas like Wakefield, Oldham, Hull, etc., where people think that we've been in that organisation for a number of years and we're just getting nowhere. It's a sense of desperation. And when you understand that, you know, I think it's absolute rubbish when people say that people would 100% leave and 100% or 100% remain. The people I spoke to fitted in a spectrum of between 45 and 55%. And I spoke to polling clerks after the election, and they said they'd never seen people staying in the polling booth as long as they were, because they couldn't make their mind up. Because even though people had views about leaving or not leaving the EU, the real issue is they wanted things to change. They're fed up with things as they are now. So I thought the EU referendum were a diversion. That Britain's economy is in trouble whether it's in the EU or not.
Okay. How about trans rights? That's something that's been quite divisive on the left recently. What's your take on all that?
Well, I don't find it a divisive issue for myself. It's a very clear trade union issue. And I found this out of so many things as a trade union official over 40 years. The answer is dialogue. Once people start passing things down and telling people what they should be thinking, or not listening to each other and shouting, you very rarely get an answer. And, you know, like the union, I'm a complete supporter of trans rights. I've got no issue with that at all. But the debate has to be about what the issues is about. And at this moment in time, people are having a slightly different debate. I've had to deal with this issue. It's not a problem. This issue, members go to work, and there are members who are trans at work. And that issue's been there ever since I've been a shop steward. Trans right is about establishing equality for trans people. And if once you start moving away from that into other issues, when you get a problem, I have absolutely no problem with it. And sometimes at work, it becomes an issue, but only if you don't sit down with the members and discuss it properly.
Okay. How about CEDAW, I think it's pronounced, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. I think it was 1986. We were going to sign it in this country, and it's never been signed into domestic law. Well,
you know, I'm really clear that the campaign for discrimination against women, for a union whose membership is 70%, and I'm talking now as a trade union rep, not as a Labour Party member, when my views are very similar, but it's slightly different situation, is that unless we deal with the double discrimination that women suffer in this country, we're never going to get equality and the sort of socialist ideas that I want. And I read a quote today, and I've never seen it before, but I really liked it from Tom Mann, which said socialism isn't about robbing, it's taking money from the rich. It's stopping the rich taking money from the poor. And for me, unless you look at the issue of how women have been double discriminated in society over hundreds of years and take that issue away, give the equality, give the economic power, give the support at work, then you can't. Legislation is irrelevant to them. We need to change how the system works.
Okay. How about Black Lives Matter? What's your take on that?
I think I'm going to say it's an interesting issue, but that would be demeaning the actual issue involved. What is interesting, I think, for most people is I think that most people who were on the left in the Union and on the left in the Labour Party would understand that you could have had that conversation about that sort of incident that happened in the United States 30 years ago and any other day for the last 30 years. And it's quite interesting in life, isn't it, that sometimes something hits a nerve. And perhaps if that incident hadn't been filmed, it would have been different. But the time came and the incident came and it transformed things. And I read a really interesting article the other day about data for black workers in America. This organisation was about data. And it says you'll get the answers you want from the data, depending on who collates the data. What they've done is set up a multicultural organisation involving black people, involving trans people, involving lesbian, gay people, and saying, well, what data have we been looking for? And it is absolutely amazing. I try and keep off the mainstream about repeating what something might say in The Guardian or on BBC Newsnight. I saw an interview the other day with Danny Rose, who comes from the same town as me, who were born in Doncaster like I am. He plays professional football in the Premier League. And he was giving a list of the number of times he, as a professional footballer, has been stopped. And one of them in the last couple of weeks had been stopped at his mum and dad's in Doncaster, just for the car that he drove. This sort of basic attitude, really, that hasn't moved on since Stephen Lawrence, that somehow people in authority can have perceptions about people and treat them differently based on what their colour happens to be. And there's a massive, I've been highly involved in this. We had a strike in my branch in Kirklees Unison on the bins 2 years ago, an absolutely rock solid strike on the bins, where 25% of the members are Afro-Caribbean. There's not a large Afro-Caribbean population in Kirklees, but there is one. And some of the comments that came out from our members that management had used to them, meetings of, I can think of one in particular, where a member had got up and asked a question, a member that had been born in Jamaica. And the manager said, in an equal equalities council that has equality policies all over the place, the manager had said, after he'd asked the question twice, can you sit down? I can't understand a word you're saying. And he'd said that in front of another 100 bin workers and totally humiliated that bin worker. And when we went out on strike, it was quite interesting listening to some of the white bin workers who said, Paul, we should have done this earlier. We've let this develop. At the time, we were embarrassed, but we want to get up home. We know management like that. But a time comes when you have to make a stand. And that stand's being made now. But it's not caused by the filming of that incident. That the filming of that incident became the trigger point for a movement I don't think people saw coming, but it had to come.
Okay. Just to move on more about the union now. So there's a few candidates standing, or there has been a few candidates. A few people put themselves forward. I know you're putting yourself forward as a candidate for the left. How do you avoid splitting the left vote?
I don't think I'd ever call myself a candidate of the left, and that's not weaseling out of the situation, because I think that's a box that sometimes people put somebody in. I'm really clear. I'm a trade unionist. I'm really clear. I'm a socialist. And if the members ever ask me who I voted for in any general election, any leadership election, I will tell them who that I voted for. So I think, these terms are often used to put people in a box or out of a box and deal with personalities. There are 5 people standing in the election, or there's 5 people declared themselves as candidates. The process is between the 10th of August and the 25th of September. You have to meet a minimum number of nominations from branches or regions or the national executive. And if you meet that minimum number of nominations, then you're on the ballot paper. And the key is always getting on the ballot paper. I'm really clear about that. I think in 2010 and 2014, if John McDonnell had got on the ballot paper, he'd have got a good vote. The issue was keeping him off the ballot paper. And I think a lot of people will support Jeremy Corbyn in 2016 and were so relieved when he got on the ballot paper. Would have been quite pleased if he'd have come third. But what happened then, people were rejuvenated by that. The membership tripled within 12, 18 months. People were excited. There were massive meetings. And I want to transfer that excitement really into the union. A number of people will get onto the ballot paper. The maximum number will be 5, but it could be less than that. Some people might not get the minimum number of nominations. But I want a campaign where a turnout isn't the 9% that it's been in previous elections. And you can only do that by talking to people about the issues that matter. The issues that matter at this moment in time, they change on a daily basis. But I said this at a meeting, an NHS demo meeting in Leeds yesterday. If you ask people what do they want the most in this country, I would guarantee you that 90% of people would say, we want to return to normal. It's the second question that's important. What's normal? Because what's going to become normal in Britain in the next 2 years is the government and the employing class in this country wanting to get the money out back that they've spent over the last 6 or 7 months. And it can only come out of terms and conditions, it can come out of pensions, and it can come out of wages. And that's why nurses are so wound up, and health workers in general are so wound up. So for me, it's not about being a left candidate, which I would describe myself as, but it's about being a candidate with the answers for the members. You could tell when you're speaking at a meeting, anybody who's spoken at a meeting can tell you this, that you can tell when you're hitting the nail on the head. And yesterday when I was talking about the situation facing us, how absolutely frustrated and tired health workers are, people are looking for leadership. And the leadership has to come from the General Secretary, the highest elected position in the union.
Okay. I'm so sorry. Just to give us an idea of where you are politically, who did you vote for in the Labour leadership elections?
In which year?
The last couple.
The last couple, I voted for Corbyn twice and Long Bailey.
Okay. All right. Just so people have an idea.
Yeah.
How do you think the union can become more democratic and more activist-led, as opposed to being, at the moment, I don't hear from anybody in the union. I just get an envelope full of what looks like junk mail for private dentists. So something, you know, less a service provider and more an activist, engaging organisation.
I spoke to a lad the other day who I've known as a steward for 35 years, and this man is a highways operative. He would describe himself as a hole digger. And he said the trouble with the union, Paul, is it's trying to become a bank. It's basing itself on where's the money coming from, where are we banking it, what buildings are we buying, what buildings do we own, what assets have we got. And for me, we've got to do 2 things in the union. We've got to move away from that model. That's not a trade union. That's a mixture of a charity and some sort of solicitor's office. And also, we've got to have a clear dividing line between elected officials and employed officials. If you don't have that dividing line, you don't have accountability. So at the moment, the only position that's elected in the union which paid where you get a wage and you work for the union is the General Secretary. And I think we should also elect the 5 assistant General Secretaries and the 12 regional secretaries. And then they would be elected officials subject and accountable to the service groups and the areas that they work in or the regions that they work in. And then everybody else is an employee, and it's their job to keep out of the politics of the union. Because once people who are full-time off on fairly good salaries have full time to decide and develop what's happening in the union, people who are lay officials, people who have a job, who have a living, haven't got a price. They haven't got all day to do that sort of organisation. So for me, my number 1 priority, if I was elected General Secretary, is we need to set up some sort of leadership school across the country where people can say, look, somebody else isn't going to do this. We want you to do it. We want you to come forward and do it. We will provide the resources. So it's a double-edged campaign for me. One is we need to get lay activists more involved. To do that, you've got to have more collective bargaining. You've got to have more time off trade union officials. You've got to have more contact with lay officials on the ground. But the union only consists of the branches and the members. There's nothing else. So I'm standing on a policy doubling the amount of money that goes to the branches so they can buy buildings locally that they control, that they own, that they staff and they resource, but also that we're going to employers and not saying somebody in a suit represents the union in some sort of legal capacity, but these 10 people who have been elected at your workplace, they represent the 600 members at your workplace, and you've to take them seriously. I would say the majority of our members don't know who the General Secretary is. The majority of members don't know what branch they're in. The majority of members wouldn't know how to become a steward. And that's got to change. Absolutely, utterly got to change. Otherwise, you'll think you're paying into some sort of friendly society that you can call on. Well, you can't call on something that's not active.
Okay. What would you do to improve union membership and representation in underrepresented sectors and workplaces? So, for example, I work in a GP practice. Nurses and doctors are unionised and they have representation, but GP receptionists, who make up about 50% of our staff, don't have, in general, aren't represented. So how would you reach places like that?
It's a double answer what I'm going to give you now. On the one hand, we need to look at, and this is why the link with the Labour Party and the trade union is so vital. For the first time ever in 2018, the amount of money that went into local government didn't go into democratically elected bodies. It went to arm's length companies, it went to academies, it went to private companies. We've got to look at the democracy. A bloke once brought into my office in Huddersfield in the 1954 yearbook for Huddersfield Corporation. And when you looked at that yearbook, you would see that Huddersfield Council was the water authority. You would see that it was the ambulance authority. You would see it was a hospital authority, a fire authority, a police authority. The Dewsbury Council had a power station. And the first thing we need to start off with is everybody should be working, who's taking public money, everybody should be working for an organisation that's democratically controlled, including the health service. And then you start talking about having collective bargaining rights for individuals. Because if you go to a hospital or a council, well, however badly organised some of them are, some are very well organised, there's a recognition within the structure of those organisations. There's a staff side, a trade union side. There's a right to be represented. There's a right for disciplinary representation, for grievance. If you speak to any Unison branch secretary who's representing people in doctors' surgeries or private care homes or voluntary sector organisations, you spend half your time trying to work out what disciplinary process our members are working under, or what grievance process, or whether people can or can't. But half of these employers don't even know you've got a legal right to representation in a disciplinary or grievance hearing. So, you know, if you took a doctor, I'm picking on you, but if you took a doctor's surgery as an example, then I don't think that should be private practice. I think it should be part of a national health service. And within that, people have rights of representation, rights of time off, rights for negotiation, pension rights, etc. Because if you looked at the one issue of pensions, when I started work in the late 70s, everybody took it for granted in the public sector that you had a job for life and a decent pension. And my dad said it to me. He said, you're not going in private sector, Paul, so you won't earn big money, but you've got a job for life and a pension. Well, I think most people would be really glad about having that, and it's not available. So you've got to give people collective bargaining rights, but you've got to give them the framework in which to use those rights.
Okay, great. So how do we reverse 40 years of worsening living conditions for ordinary people in this country?
Well, I think you saw how we do it in 2017. And if you look at the 2017 election result, we came within about 3,000 votes for getting rid of the Tories. And then you saw the Labour Leaks report about what people were thinking about that. Senior people in the union who were living on the money donated by ordinary working people. It's ordinary working people that pay subscriptions. It's not the union that donate money. That's how we change things, and that's why the membership of the Labour Party trebled, and that's why we came so close, and that's why we got 12.8 million votes. You've got to inspire people that you actually want to change. I think the people at the top of society, particularly in the political part of society, don't want to inspire anybody. There are people there who would be quite happy for the membership of the Labour Party to reduce. The smaller the better, because you can sort things out behind closed doors. We need the light of democracy on things. And you've got to have people who inspire people to do something. Everybody I would say the vast majority of people who get involved in the politics or the union don't do it for bad reasons. They do it because they feel there's an injustice somewhere, or something needs changing, or somebody needs representing. It's only when they get sucked into it sometimes, and there's money floating about, and no democracy floating about. I don't judge what happens in situations on personalities. I judge it. Look, if you decide you don't want to support the policies of the Labour Party, if you decide you don't like the direction the Labour Party is going, stand as an independent. You'll see how many votes you get. And Change UK saw that. Not one single Labour Party MP who defected to Change UK, and there were 8 of them, got elected in the 2019 election. So the mandatory selection, the politics, the money from the unions are all interconnected. It's about having to stand up and explain what you're doing to people. And you can't explain what you're doing to people if nobody knows who you are.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so you mentioned 2017 general election and the Labour Party winning, but we're looking at the moment at another 4 odd years of Conservative government. So what can we do to start fighting back against the Conservative government now?
Well, I'll start off by disagreeing with that. I don't think we're looking at 4 years of a Tory government. I think Johnson will be lucky to see this year out, and I also think that anything could happen within Parliament. They've got the EU situation coming up at the end of December this year. There's all this money that's floated about in furlough and subsidy and for business, etc. That's got to be paid back. There is going to be a monsoon of changes coming in the next 12 to 18 months. So whether we're looking at 4 years or not, I have no idea. I just think that people in a year's time will look back on this and think this is a very, very sane period. The reality is it isn't the same period at this moment in time, but we're moving into troubled waters. And I think Johnson will be gone by December 2020. This can't continue. This farce on the sort of COVID-19 and changing direction every other week. And you can go out if you spend money, but you can't go out if you don't spend money. All that's going to come home to roost. So, we need to increase the membership in the union. Within the Labour Party, we need to inspire people that we want a better world. That's why people voted Labour after the second. I spent a lot of my youth talking to my grandma and granddad about what had happened in the 1920s and 30s and why the Labour vote had been so strong in the 40s. We nearly got there in 2017. Can you imagine this COVID crisis now if we had a proper government talking to health service workers about what they should have been paid, how they should get PPE equipment? I haven't heard a single politician mention that in 2006, the Labour government privatised NHS supplies in Britain. NHS Logistics used to provide all the supplies for NH hospitals. And we had Patricia Rowett, then the health secretary, explaining why it had to be privatised. And then we're getting farces of spending 50, 60, 70 million pounds on equipment that doesn't work from private companies that nobody quite knows who ordered it or who knows who. So I'm really of the view that what's coming in the next 12 months to 2 years will be radically reflected in Parliament. And it ain't a question of waiting 4 years. I think that both parties, but at least certainly think the Tory party could split. Even now, think the Tory party could split because it's going nowhere. It might look in the opinion polls that things are all right, but if you talk to people on the streets, and that's my advantage, I don't live in a bubble in Westminster or in London. If you talk to people on the streets, they're absolutely at the wit's end. They're frightened to death about coronavirus and returning to normal, but they're at wit's end about what the policy. There's an old motto in trade unions. If you go and see a group of members that's got a grievance, you have to answer one question: what's the plan? And nobody thinks the government's got a plan, and that's why we're going to enter a period of tumult in the next 12 to 18 months.
Okay, I guess what I was trying to get at with that question is what role do you see the union rather than the Labour Party as playing in holding the Conservative government to account?
Well, the unions is going to start with, the first thing it's going to start with is the outcome of the last 6 months in coronavirus. We've got to be fully behind the health workers and their pay claim. They can't believe what's happened to them. You know, and what's happened to them is very similar to what happened to soldiers coming back from the First World War. The government thanked them, patted them on the back, said, there's no job for you, there's no house for you, there's no money for you. Thank you very much for what you did. And that's how NHS workers are thinking this moment in time. So if I were going to take 2 steps now as a trade union leader within the environment of things that's happened over the last 6 months, there would be a massive pay rise for healthcare workers. But we mustn't forget the people who's been in an equally precarious position, the people working in the private care sector. And they've been there without any accountability. And if I hear one senior politician say this, I go bonkers. They keep saying, oh, nobody wants to work there. Nobody wants the wage rates that they've got there. If there were £15 an hour minimum in care homes, there'd be people queuing up to be trained. We need to bring them care homes back in-house. So they're the 2 big issues for me. The pay rise for the NHS, proper pay in private care homes with proper collective bargaining rights. Because we've seen who looks after us. In times of crisis, we're not looked after by millionaires in the Bahamas or hedge fund managers. We're looked after by ordinary working people. You know, people have looked derogatory at people who do low-paid jobs, like people who stock shelves in supermarkets or sweep the roads or clean. They're not looking like that at them now. People understand in a hospital that unless it's thoroughly cleaned in a dangerous environment, it's a dangerous place to go. So I think we have a chance now to address the issues of low pay and job security and bringing public sector back into the public sector care homes. They're the 2 big jobs over the next 6 months.
Brilliant. All right, that was all my questions. Thanks a lot for your time, Paul.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Bye.